live long and prosper. So in this video series, I'm going to be talking through the social justice elements of every episode of the original series of Star Trek. The thing that inspired this project was actually a Fox News article which argued that Star Trek has in some way betrayed its traditional commitment to sort of political neutrality or middle ground by embracing progressive politics. In this series, we're going to see that Star Trek has always embraced progressive politics, and it's always been aspirational for social justice in various senses. I am taking a broad perspective on social justice here, so that may include multiple different types of social justice, whether that's racial, whether that's economic, whether that's religious, whether that's abilities, gender and sexuality, anything broadly considered. I will go through every episode. Some of the episodes I will interview fellow Trekkies and talk with them about it. And then below, in the descriptions, I will give you additional information about the episodes, particularly their original air date, who wrote the screenplay, and who directed that episode. I also want to dedicate this series to my dad, Michael Allen Zapkin. He was an OG Trekkie from back in the day, and it was watching the original series with him that I came to love Star Trek. In this video, we're going to talk about the episode Dagger of the Mind. So, this episode is set largely in the penal colony of Tantalus 5. Basically, at the beginning of the episode, the Enterprise crew beams down some supplies to the colony, and they beam up one box, which happens to contain Simon Van Gelder. Van Gelder had been a doctor and the second in command at the Tantalus penal colony, but he's now gone mad. Oh no! Anyway, he's escaped onto the Enterprise. The Enterprise is going to take him back when McCoy starts having some suspicions that something untoward might be happening on the colony, partially because of the weird reactions Van Gelder is having. And so Kirk contacts Dr. Adams, who is in charge of the penal colony. Adams invites Kirk down. They hang out for a bit, and then Adams shows Kirk a machine called the neural neutralizer. Basically what the neural neutralizer... So Adams says that it's a failure, that it has not been a successful treatment method. But this is where Van Gelder went wrong. This is where things went sideways for him, because, according to Adams, Van Gelder didn't believe that he had the right to experiment on somebody else if he had not tried out this neural neutralizer on himself. And so he tried it out on full intensity with no one there to safeguard him, and it basically destroyed his mind. Nonetheless, Adams says they continue using it out of the hope that it might have some beneficial effect for the more violent patients. Kirk is not entirely convinced by this line of reasoning, and so he and Helen Noel, who is a psychologist, and she gets chosen by McCoy to go down to the planet with Kirk, because this is roughly her area of specialization. She and Kirk have a bit of a history that's kind of not entirely fleshed out. but he's clearly not that keen on having her along, etc., etc. Anyway, so Kirk and Helen Noel go into the room with the neural neutralizer, and she neural neutralizes Kirk so that he can figure out what it is that's going on, and she's able to plant suggestions in his head when the machine neutralizes his neural patterns, etc., etc. Dr. Adams and one of his hench people find them there. The hench person grabs Helen, and Dr. Adams takes over the controls, and he implants a much different suggestion into Kirk's mind. Basically, he starts overwriting Kirk's mind, overwriting Kirk's memories, which is apparently the thing that he has done systematically to his patients. Yada, 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 stuff happens. Helen, sort of bad 80s commando movie style, crawls through the air duct to turn off the power to the penal colony's force field so that Spock can beam in, and then some security guys can beam in. And they basically manage to defeat Adams, round up all his hench people, etc., etc. Adams and Kirk have a fight in the room with the neural neutralizer while the power is off. Kirk punches Adams out, and then Spock turns the power back on. The neural neutralizer comes on while Adams is unconscious under it, and then Adams dies. So, social justice themes. One of the big social justice themes is the treatment of prisoners. So, in the US in particular, one of the big issues in terms of the way we conceptualize prison is what the purpose of prison is. Whether this is meant as punishment for offenses, or whether this is meant to rehabilitate criminals so that they can re-enter society as productive members of society. In the US, largely we tend to view prison as retributive justice. That is, we tend to see the purpose of prison as to punish prisoners for their crimes. Whereas in many other countries, places like Norway, for instance, other Scandinavian countries, prison is meant to rehabilitate, is meant to help criminals through whatever issues it was that led to their crimes. And so there's much more of an emphasis on dealing with negative behaviors in such a way that when the person is released, they will not reoffend. In the US, we have massive recidivism rates. We have massive, like if you go to prison in the US, statistically, you are much more likely to go back to prison. And part of that has to do with the social stigma around having been in prison, having been a convict, or a felon, or whatever it is. Part of that has to do with the fact that the way that the prison system is run in the US is not intended to be beneficial. And so very often people who go to prison for low-level crimes, non-violent crimes, etc., are more likely to commit crimes because in prison they are conditioned into an increasingly criminal mindset. And there's a massive amount of evidence about this. So, Dagger of the Mind raises these questions. What do we intend for prisons to do, and how do we get there? Now, this is the episode's treatment of this, I think, is very complicated, actually, because on the one hand, Adams's neural neutralizer does seem to cut down on patients' violent impulses, etc., etc. It does seem to eliminate a lot of the negative behaviors that would have led to these people being incarcerated in the first place. So in that sense, there is maybe a component of it where it can actually benefit criminals. At the same time, it is essentially a torture device. I mean, and it can directly be used as a torture device. It's used that way on Van Gelder, because we learn that Van Gelder did not, in fact, put himself in that situation. Adams put him in that situation and destroyed his mind. Adams uses the neural neutralizer essentially to torture Kirk. And part of the conditioning that Adams uses with the neural neutralizer is, so let's say you had someone who's there for murder. They have difficulty controlling their violent impulses. Adams might overwrite their mind in such a way that they feel physical pain whenever they experience the desire for violence or the compulsion to violence. And so it is about creating pain responses in the brain. And so in this sense, it is retributive, even as it is about eliminating the criminal impulse. So I think it's a complicated situation that we have in terms of this question of what is prison meant to do? Is it meant to rehabilitate, or is it meant to penalize? Because in this case, the very method that seems to lead toward rehabilitation is also incredibly violent and incredibly painful. And so that's a nice, interesting, complicated element here. There's another important aspect with the story that Adams tells about how Van Gelder came to lose his mind. This idea that Van Gelder felt he couldn't try the neural neutralizer on someone else if he hadn't first tried it on himself, and so he put it on full power with no one else there, and basically destroyed his brain in that way. So one thing, there's a logical problem that it doesn't make that much sense, because Helen tells Kirk that there are other similar devices that are not as sophisticated as the one that Adams is using, but the principle and a variation of the practice is used in other hospitals, other penal colonies, etc., etc. So the idea that Van Gelder would say, this is a completely unknown technology, I can't experiment on anybody but myself, that doesn't make that much sense if we accept that Helen is telling the truth, and she has no reason to lie about that. But the other thing is, and I talked about this in the video about Miri as well, medical ethics means you do not, one part of it is you do not experiment on yourself, right? Because in Miri, Dr. McCoy takes the untested antidote to the aging plague, injects himself with it. Medically, no, you don't do that. That's just not how you do things. In that case, at least, there was a life or death situation in which, if they didn't somehow test this serum, they were all going to die. In this instance, Van Gelder, it just doesn't make any sense from a medical professional's perspective that Van Gelder would say, I am going to try this on myself at full intensity with no one there in case something goes wrong. That story itself does not make any sense because of proper medical practices in which you do controlled tests. But also, again, it doesn't make any sense that Van Gelder would test something on himself at full intensity anyway. So while we do find out that that's not really what happened, just that idea raises, again, this question of medical ethics and how you treat patients in an ethical way, or how you run medical testing in an ethical and responsible way.